Thank you, Emily. It is indeed a pleasure to be speaking today, and to such a diverse audience. I mean, we really are. Jim and I really are pleased that this webinar has attracted attendees from a truly North American audience. In Canada, it's from Pacific Coast to Atlantic Coast, from British Columbia to Nova Scotia, and we see that many states from the United States are represented on this webinar. And I'd also like to first by kind of comment on the collaboration between the Partnership for Water Sustainability in British Columbia and Forster University, and give you, especially our American audience, a bit of background. The partnership is a not-for-profit entity and is funded by government, and so in British Columbia we deliver services on behalf of government. So we are really excited by this opportunity to share our experiences with a North American audience. And we also hope that today is the first step towards a library of webcast resources that will benefit us all. And within an hour, there's a lot of ground to cover. So we're hitting the highlights, introducing a lot of concepts, and there's certainly potential to create modules that will delve into the details. And I think once you hear the technical part of the presentation by my colleague Jim Dumont, you'll begin to get an appreciation for that. And so in terms of stepping back and saying, well, what's the driver for the approach that we're going to be presenting in the next hour? Well, it's all about reduced risk, reduced financial liability. That's what's driving us in British Columbia. And so in terms of our new normal, it's climate of extremes. It's floods and droughts. That's our pattern. As we see as we experience the impacts of a changing climate. And so we are water guys, Jim and I are, but part of our messaging is what happens on the land does matter. And so in British Columbia, we are looking at the water cycle with fresh eyes. We're developing new approaches, methodologies, and tools. But the genesis for these methodologies and tools goes back 15, 20, 25 years, and it's been a building blocks process as we are working towards what we are now defining as sustainable watershed systems through asset management. And we have been using that terminology for about the last 18 months in terms of advancing a different way of doing business in British Columbia. So just to give context, or geographic context, to those in our audience from Colorado and Texas and Georgia who may not necessarily know where British Columbia is, this will give you a sense of the geography, where we're located on the continent. And as you can see, the length of British Columbia is almost equivalent to the distance from the U.S.-Canadian border to the U.S.-Mexican border. But of our population of more than 4.5 million people, 3/4 are clustered in a small corner in the southwest part of British Columbia. Jim and I, we live in a region which is referred to as the Georgia Basin. That's the island of the east coast of Vancouver Island and mainland and the waters in between. So there's a population of about 3.5 million people here. So a picture is always worth 1,000 words. This is what the Georgia Basin looks like. You can see by that red line, there's the boundary with the American border. You can see that Seattle is only 2 hours away from us, so we may be known as the Great White North, but our climate is the same as Washington State. The significance of showing you this Google image of British Columbia is you can literally see that our backs are against the mountains, and we're hemmed in by the mountains, by the water, by the U.S. border, and we have another dimension which is rather unique to British Columbia, which is called the Agricultural Land Reserve. So going back to 1972, our agricultural lands were set aside in a reserve to protect them from urban sprawl. So a lot of what we've done over the last generation is not necessarily being driven because we're better people. We've had no choice. As the population has grown, it's forced us to think about how we develop land, how we respect the land, how we treat the land, and moving us toward a design with nature approach, because that's the reality that we're dealing with in terms of being in harmony with our environment. And the environment is very important to British Columbians. And that leads into what differentiates us from so many other parts of the continent is our watershed health goal. And as you saw from that previous photograph, we are primarily a mountainous region. So what that means is that our headwater streams are a predominant feature. And I think you're probably aware that the salmon is an icon in this part of the world. If there's a problem with the salmon, it's just like the canary in the coal mine. Means we have cause for concern. So watershed health, as we define it, is very much about protection of aquatic habitat. And in that sense, the critical issue for aquatic habitat damage and loss is that caused by land development and erosion of streams. And Jim will elaborate on the significance of what that means in terms of the impact of development on erosion and what that means for our streams. So in terms of what we've been going through, it has been very much a building blocks process of linking rainfall, the landscape upon which the rain falls, the flow that we see in our creeks, the proportion of the annual water balance that actually makes it into groundwater. And we have been gravitating to this phrase called sustainable service delivery, which is really encompassing everything that local government does. So the emphasis being on the services that are provided, and in this case we're talking about the services that are provided by a watershed to sustain aquatic habitat and sustain the water needs of our population. So it's been a building blocks process. The significance of highlighting 2002, well, 2002 was the year of release of a guidance document in this province called Stormwater Planning, a guidebook for British Columbia. And I was the project manager and the principal author. And in 2002, in response to the salmon crisis of the 1990s, that's when we first began to grapple with and the whole notion or the issue of how will we reduce runoff volume, because that was what was causing the environmental damage. And building on that foundation, you'll see the kind of a series of kind of milestone years as we've added to our understanding, as science-based understanding becomes clearer over time. By 2007, we were realizing the significance of mimicking the flow duration, and Jim was going to go into great detail in terms of explaining what that means to you. By 2012, we were looking at, okay, how do we sustain that proportion of the water balance, which we call deep infiltration. By 2013, it was kind of coming together in terms of the methodology for how do we integrate performance targets to maintain, and mimic the water balance, the distribution, the temporal distribution, the proportion that goes by each of the water balance pathways. And as you can see, 2013, 2014, 2015, things are beginning to accelerate now in terms of how do we take watershed scale targets, how do we downscale them to the site level, how do we begin to view water balance pathways as infrastructure assets providing services. So that's a kind of a key point, that we're at a point now where we're saying view water balance pathways as infrastructure assets providing services. It's beginning to shape how we see things and do things. And so the paradigm, the new paradigm as we've called it, which only goes back 18 months, we're saying watersheds are infrastructure assets. And really this is the local government way of thinking, that you manage and you protect your other assets. Well, treat your watersheds the same way, because if you don't manage and protect your watersheds, well, there are downstream consequences in terms of cost to restore and repair, et cetera, et cetera. So just beginning to communicate to boards and councils and the public to think in terms of the watershed as an integrated system. I mean, it sounds obvious, but you have to keep repeating these words. Jim will explain what that means. And then with particular emphasis on the three pathways by which rainfall reaches streams. And we're saying those pathways, over the land surface, the shallow horizontal, which is otherwise known as interflow, and that deep vertical pathway to groundwater, well, they are infrastructure assets, and these pathways provide water balance services. So that's kind of your big picture concept of where we're at in British Columbia, why we're doing it. And on that note, I'm going to hand the baton off to Jim Dumont to get into the details.